Most people want wealth. They want to be rich, but they are afraid to admit it. They act as though there is something morally wrong with wanting to be wealthy. We are told in Deuteronomy 8, verse 18, "But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth." Now, the purpose of enabling us to get wealth, we are told, is that he may establish his covenant, which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. The purpose of wealth, in other words, is to do covenant work, to do God's work. Now, the Bible condemns wealth that is wrongly gained, but it tells us that honest wealth is a good. Moreover, it tells us that wealth is to be a stewardship. Our whole lives are to be a stewardship unto God. We are not here to live for ourselves or to accumulate possessions for ourselves, but as stewards of Almighty God, to accomplish the purposes of His kingdom here on earth, that we might be members of His eternal kingdom. The Bible, as we see, condemns wrongful wealth. It also condemns debt. We have a crisis today in that historically the middle class has been the greatest supporter of things Christian. But today, the people who give the most are those who are the poorest and the richest. In other words, those who receive under $25,000 a year income, and those who receive over $100,000 a year income are the best donors to all kinds of charitable concerns. This is quite a surprising fact. Those in the middle range, earning between $25,000 and $100,000 a year in income, are those who give the lowest percentage of their income. They are also the people who are most heavily in debt. The sad fact is, we have to add, that if they are evangelical Christians, they are more in debt than their ungodly neighbors. Evangelicals seem to believe that because they love the Lord is going to bail them out of whatever they do. As a result, they are more prone to going into debt. As a result, we are slowly but surely losing our capacity to produce wealth as a nation, because the basic group, the middle class, uses its income increasingly in order to promote itself, to have a boat, to have 2 and 3 cars, to have 3 televisions in the house, to have a summer home, and so on and on. The middle class, which is numerically the greatest class in the country, is less and less oriented to stewardship and more to its personal satisfaction. As a result, this group, where most of the wealth of the country is concentrated, is today the least effectual group, and the poor are far more prone to giving than the middle class. This is a loss of faith. It is a loss of initiative, of the work ethic, and much more. We are on our way to being a poor country and a poor people. Debt, the love of leisure, self-indulgence, all these things are destroying them. True wealth is more than personal advantage. It is a cultural fact. It is a national fact. It is a shared prosperity, and the reverse of it is a shared poverty. We had better become responsible stewards of wealth, or we will soon be sharing poverty.
R.E., what is real wealth and how is it best achieved long-term in a society?
Basically, the biblical pattern is pretty clear. Economics, or the basis of creating wealth today, is very obscure and confused in our society. But there are only two parts of the economic equation: land and labor. That's all there is, people and things. And those two together produce capital and savings, and along with work, produce wealth in a society. If you break it down even further, you could say that in order to have or maximize the factors that create wealth, you start with people who are self-governing, which is the opposite of what we have today. People look at government as being the federal government. Secondly, you look at money. And money is some commodity, such as gold or silver, or a receipt for some commodity, a receipt for wheat or soybeans. It's something out there in the real world that leads to centralization or decentralization and to covenant and contracting. And when commodities are monetized, or when we use commodities such as gold and silver as money, then we have an open system, because thanks to the laws of thermodynamics, the sun shines and that energy comes down and creates wheat or grass, and the cattle and the sheep eat the wheat and grass. So we have unlimited potential wealth, and because we have unlimited wealth and unlimited commodities, we can have unlimited money in a godly system, an honest and just weight and measure. Thirdly, you have the specialization and division of labor. That leads to trade. It also leads to prosperity and peace, because where people cooperate with each other in terms internally in a country or even with other nations, they tend to get along and not go to war, because war destroys wealth. And yet our public school system today trains us all to be alike, rather than the godly perspective, which is to develop us in terms of our godly character and then find the calling God has given us. And when we find our calling, we need each other, so we tend to trade back and forth in that specialization and division of labor. Very important point, and we miss that today totally in our culture. Next, because wealth can be cumulative over time, you can have inheritance. And without some natural disaster or some personal disaster in a godly family, we know it's promised basically blessings down to the third and fourth generation. Each generation should be wealthier than the one that preceded it. And yet today we have inheritance taxes that strip, for example, the farmers from passing it on to the next generation.
Well, there really is this idea in modern-day America, isn't there, that progress is just sort of an automatic thing that that everyone's entitled to. Now, what is it? Gazette said something like, but progress, civilization is not just there like the crust of the earth or the primeval forest. It is a function of something.
Well, I had a lecture on wealth by E.L. Kennedy, senior partner at Lehman Brothers a few years back, director of Kerr-McGee, very good friend of Ashton Oil, in charge of the oil desk. And Mr. Kennedy said all the wealth of the world comes from the earth. And the minerals, the water, the food, the earth supports the animals from which we make our clothing, our shoes, etc. Now, he said, a civilization that doesn't know how to extract the wealth of the earth, that doesn't know how to farm, that doesn't know how to extract and process metals, can walk across the surface of the earth in great poverty, like the Indians of North America. Ever since the Europeans came here, we've been told about how wealthy this area is, but it wasn't wealthy for the 150,000 Indians who set fire to the plains to trap the buffalo and who didn't extract any of the ore. Central Africa, one of the richest treasure houses in the world, was not wealthy for the inhabitants of that area before the Europeans arrived. They didn't even have a wheel for transport. And the third world illusion that Europe and the West is stealing their resources is absolute nonsense, because these resources were lying dormant, idle, in the sands of the North Africa. The Arabs had no use for oil because they had no industry. The West came, found the oil, extracted it, refined it, transported it, and paid them enormous sums of money. And they feel exploited as a result. But wealth then comes from work to transform the riches that God has placed here on earth.
Exactly.
And that's all wealth is. It's not money.
No.
It's nothing else.
Man is the ultimate resource. The creativity, the work, the calling of man developed as he uses the raw materials of the earth and then develops the tools. And that's another source of wealth I was coming to. Technology. But then again, Otto, that's also based upon a willingness to save and invest. And our society doesn't save. It's in debt, which is the opposite of savings.
Well,
so we're not going to be wealthy long term.
At one time, we did, and we created the largest, most complex technological civilization the world has ever seen. At this moment, we have the largest number of highly skilled people of any country the world has ever seen. What we have had here was a breakdown on the top, something like the third and fourth generation of the Pilgrims, who made so much money in New England and who built cities and towns, and then got very fat and began to speculate, set up open-ended trusts to take care of the inheritance thing and so forth. So they shifted into a finance-oriented commerce instead of the basic productivity.
I may be getting ahead of what Ari was saying, but I think to say land and labor leaves out a very important element, and that is, what does the person bring to bear? What's the mindset? What's the worldview? What's the standard of truth, the standard of values that causes you? How do you look at that land? How do you look at those resources? What kind of institutional arrangements do you think are right and what kinds are wrong? Who gets to own or control the tools? It's what's in the mind of the men and women that has such a significant sense of whether or not there will be wealth and what kind of wealth.
And a Christian who rightfully divides the word of truth will see Christ's discussion, his parable in the New Testament with regard to the talents, and also who can trust a man with godly things unless he's been first proven to be successful with unrighteous mammon. His calling is a proving ground for advancement in God's kingdom.
Well, the Marxists thought that the ownership of the tools of production were all that was required to be wealthy. But obviously, in Marxist hands, the tools of production do not produce wealth.
No.
Because wealth is produced by the common multitude and not by the fellow sitting on top. The infrastructure of our technology is what the Soviet Union has not been able to duplicate. Because although it has the tools of production, it will not allow its people the free play of their creativity. And therefore they have what is essentially an impoverished society. All it has is the guns.
Right. That's why people and things are the two parts of the economic equation. But people are always more important than things because they can be the ultimate resource, or they can be slaves, they can be predators, they can be parasites. People determine whether the earth is turned into a garden or a wasteland. And that's effectively what you were saying.
And the key factor in people is character.
Yes.
Faith and character. Because without that, they will live with all this wealth that is under their feet and never make use of it. So without the faith, without the character, the human part of this equation is worthless.
There's also that faith and that character can be enhanced or diminished depending on the institutional arrangements. Thomas Sowell, a social analyst down at the Hoover Institute, has written a number of things. And one of the things which was very penetrating to me was talking about the same ethnic group, the Chinese, how little is produced in mainland China. American Motors, for example, I understand, had built a plant there. It is hard to get some of the people to stop sleeping on the job because the tools are essentially controlled by somebody else. These same individual Chinese who decide for whatever reason to join a family member or just get out and go to Hong Kong, takes them characteristically, if I remember his figures correctly, between 6 and 12 months to readjust to the fact that I'm free to do something else and I better. And suddenly they become a very different, productive individual because the institutional arrangements are so profoundly different.
Exactly. In a slave state, the only incentive people have for accumulating wealth is by way of leisure time. So they take their leisure time by not working, by not being productive.
Well, it's what's being said here that basically that you have to have the right religion to produce wealth.
No,
and if you don't have it, you aren't going to produce
no
wealth.
question. Government is always religion applied to economics.
Could you expand on that, Ari? Because that's like a code, a key code or something.
Okay, government is always religion applied to economics. All governments do is legislate religious ideas about right or wrong, ethics and morality, good and evil. Then these legislated ideas about religion, these laws, in turn determine the rules and the framework of the economic arena in which we all live. So it comes down from religion to government to economics. It's cause and effect. You reap what you sow.
Well, also, it's a very tangible world. You have a stone house. They used to build houses of stone in Latin America because that was where the family would remain forever. And they got as much land as they could. They built up great big stone houses. And the storm couldn't blow it down, and they bought it, they paid for it, and that kept it. Now, money is something else. I had a friend tell me that he was in, I think it was Shanghai, even later than I was there, in the closing period of the Chiang Kai-shek regime. And he said there were a bunch of old men, fat old men, weeping and sitting in front of basketfuls of money that was no longer any good.
That's why money needs to be a commodity, something real. In the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese that got out at the end were those who had gold.
Those wafers.
That's right. Those are the only ones that were able to get out. Those that had paper Vietnamese money were left behind and enslaved by the North
I
Vietnamese
understand
communists.
that they're digging up the graves in the Soviet Union and taking the gold from the teeth of the cadavers.
My heavens.
Let me take us to this question of money for a moment. Just out of my experience in investment counseling, the number of people that come to me that have had the typical K through 12 education, maybe have even gone on through college, and have no understanding of what money, credit, and banking is. Absolutely ignorant people in their 20s saying, well, there's some real problems here. The government needs to make more money. And they have no idea what it is. And so to turn us around without that kind of an understanding of money as a commodity that retains its value and facilitates the exchange of services and goods, we've got real problems.
So you're saying you would say we've had misinformation or disinformation with regard to economic and financial reality and the creation of wealth in the school system, the educational process.
Deeply so.
We're taught, many of the children are taught, according to the socialist Marxist line, that wealth is something that the rich take away from the poor. Now, you can't take something away from a fellow who hasn't got anything.
Yeah, that is kind
It's
of
a
ironic.
fallacy to begin with. And I was interested in what Lord Bauer had to say in his book on the Third World. He said that he personally watched the rubber workers tapping rubber from the rubber trees in the plantations of Indonesia. And they had two types of workers. They had the Malay and the Chinese. And the Chinese, as you know, who got out of China and came over here were all coolies in China. Very low-level laborers who became wealthy through diligence and so forth. Well, Bauer said that the Malays produced about 1/3 the rubber that the Chinese produced, and they were paid piece rates. Now, he said they were both poor, they were both doing the same work, they were both in the same environment, in the same geographical location. What was the difference? Well, of course, the difference was the fact the Chinese knew they had to work, and the Malays felt that they could always get along in Malaysia without any hard work. So the Chinese became wealthy in Malaysia. And it's very interesting. They are extremely wealthy in Indochina, but they do not run the country. They made a deliberate choice, according to Seoul, not to intervene in the political structure, because they said if they attained political as well as economic power, they would provide an irresistible target to the Malays.
Well, your comments destroy a myth that exists in our society with regard to education that Vic brought up, and that's the myth that somehow education, by in and of itself, creates wealth.
It doesn't.
No, it's hard work, savings, learning skills, and serving other people. Biblically, that create wealth.
First immigration Jews, according to Seoul, came over here with no education, or very little, from the shtetls of Poland and Russia, and went to work as tailors, shopkeepers, ditch diggers, electricians, whatever. And it was their children they sent to school.
That's right. Rush's point on character is important here because keeping your wealth today is difficult because of all the regulation from the bureaucracy, the taxes, and yet characteristically men that had character were self-governing. And as I recall, I think Urato one wrote that ignorance of the law is no excuse. That phrase came from early American history because all men knew the law of God and were self-governing.
Absolutely. And you still do know the law. It cannot be said that a man who commits murder doesn't know that he is breaking the law, or stealing doesn't know that he's stealing.
Yes, Paul in the first chapter of Romans tells us that the things visible and invisible of God are known by all men because they are written in all their being, and they hold the truth of God, or better in the Greek, hold back, suppress, keep down the truth of God which is in every atom of their being, in unrighteousness or injustice.
Absolutely.
What has happened to wealth in America? To wealth as far as the average American family is concerned? Has the idea of what wealth is changed significantly since this country started?
There was a survey amongst the poor about 20 years ago, a poll, I guess you'd call it, mounted by some socialists who expected to hear people say that, yes, they thought wealth should be limited, that nobody should make more than a certain amount of money. And these very poor people voted no, it should not be limited. People should be allowed to make as much money as possible because they hoped, although they didn't expect to make it themselves, that their children would be free to do so.
Ought we to be concerned if there is a growing gap in this country or any country between the so-called rich and the poor, or the haves and the have-nots?
Well, we have more middle-class people than any society has ever had. We have more people who are well-to-do than any society in the history of the world. We have, the poor are a minority here. Of course, that doesn't make us more secure. Gibbon tells how on the north coast of the Mediterranean, with the heart of the Roman Empire, running all the way from Spain to the Dardanelles, there was nothing but a series of magnificent mansions, mile after mile after mile. But they sat there with their wealth. They forgot that it had to be defended and protected, that they had to do something about the teeming masses of Rome, and so forth.
John, one of my concerns as an economist in a biblical sense is that the middle class, which is that great bell-shaped curve of stability of any society, as debt-ridden as it is today during a depression, could be destroyed. And it's when you destroy the middle class and you have a very few rich and many poor that you provide the fertile breeding grounds for communism, as we've seen in Latin America.
Wouldn't it be more of a turnover than a destruction?
I would hope so, but I am concerned at this point in time that the tenets of socialism and emerging communism in our country are very great indeed.
It's odd that I would think to quote Walter Mondale, but I do remember one line out of his speech to the Democratic Convention, and it was not that I'll raise your taxes. He talked about the, and put aside the question whether or not President Mondale would have solved the problem. He obviously wouldn't, but he did have one line about how he thought most Americans felt that ours was an economy where people felt they were standing on a trap door, that you didn't know when it was going to go. I think a lot of people feel, although they don't know exactly where it's going to shake out, who's going to eat what, but that there is a big, some kind of crunch and collapse coming.
There's a generational thing. I just want to say there's one thing on the generation.
We've also basically attacked all those factors that create wealth. And so through debt, we've allowed ourselves to enjoy wealth short term, but we're paying the piper long term, and that's that trap door that people are fearing presently.
Well, just a generational question, too. The persons that I see that are most difficult, their financial situations are most difficult, tend to be the persons between 25 to 40, 45, 50. You start talking about the persons that are in their 60s and 70s, this is a generation that had a different set of values inculcated. And so they're very frequently have their this, that, and the other thing set aside. This is a different group entirely from the baby boom group.
Let me give you some... Okay, go ahead.
Yes. I think one of the problems we face is this. We are so security conscious that we are freezing society into a pattern increasingly. Now, if you look at the list of the great, powerful corporations of 1900 and those of today, there's a dramatic difference between the two. Very few corporations survived. Only if they continued to offer a service that people wanted did they last. But when we are security conscious, we seek to freeze everyone in a mold. And then we make it more difficult for those at the bottom to rise. We try to preserve things as they are.
Our time here isn't frozen, but it's run out. Thank you very much, all of you. Very interesting.